So when you're actively betting or trading in any particular market, it's helpful to understand a few things. Now, understanding the way the market's priced and so on is quite helpful, but I think that actually understanding who's on the other side, who are the market participants, what are they doing and why, is also as important, because ultimately what you're trying to do is you're trying to think about what people are thinking about when you're betting or trading. You're trying to get into the market at times where it's in your favor and where people are making suboptimal decisions. So some of the research that I've done over the years has focused on that, trying to understand not necessarily who is on the other side, but what they're doing. And in this video, I'm going to tell you what I found. So I think the psychology of trading is an aspect of trading and risk-taking that people underestimate. And it took me quite a few years for me to understand how significant this was, because in the early part of my career, I was focused on the maths, the logic and pricing and looking at, differentials between what I think the price should be and what it actually is and stuff like that. And I'd completely ignored all of the psychological side of it. Now, the problem is that comes in for a lot of grief as well, because people who are academically trained, who are very logical, obviously can't see the psychology side of things either. They maybe have intellectual intelligence, but maybe not emotional intelligence. And if you want to be a good risk taker, a good trader, you need to understand both aspects of it. Yes, you need to understand the fundamentals of the market, how it's priced and why it's priced that way, and how that could influence what you're doing. But it's really important to understand what people are doing and why, and the sort of biases that get inserted into that. I think some of the problem that people have had with the psychology of trading is you often couldn't quantify it. But as Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman demonstrated, you can quantify it and you can show where people make suboptimal decisions. So when I realized that, I started looking around the market to try and find where these biases manifest themselves in the market. And I was successful in doing that, which is what I'm going to show you in a second. But it's really important to understand how that shapes what you do when you're trading, because you're more likely to get inefficiencies in the market where people exhibit biases. And when you start digging around in the market, you tend to find a lot of biases. So the first significant bias that I found within betting markets was the propensity of people to back the favourite or to have an opinion on a favourite. And this really applies across any particular sports: greyhounds, football, tennis, cricket, rugby, football, any sport you like. You always find that there's more money bet on the favourite than there is anything else within the book. Now, the interesting thing is, if you're a bookmaker, you want to try and square your book up. So you're trying to offer odds on every single selection within the market in equal proportion. But that's almost impossible to do, because people always bet more on the favourite than they do anything else. That's what everybody goes into. If you ask somebody, go to your local racecourse and say, what are you going to have a bet on in the next race? They may say, oh, I fancy the favourite, or I don't fancy the favourite, or something. But it's a bet or no bet type situation. So, the shorter the price gets on the favourite, the more money will get bet on it, and the bigger that gap is to what you would consider to expect. So, for example, if we see something in the market at odds of 2, that has a 50% chance of winning, but you will find that it accounts for about 70% of the volume within the market. And this is fairly universal across all different sports. If I bring up a graph for you, you will see the difference, and this is on horse racing, between what the odds and the amount of the betting should be within that particular market and what it actually is. And this creates quite a large bias within the market, because you tend to find that when a favourite starts to move, people will either back it or not back it, depending upon what's going on, and that distorts the market overall. But also, people don't tend to spend that much time at the back of the book. They don't tend to see if that thing that went from 200 to 1 to 300 to 1 is actually a decent bet and probably worthwhile it over the longer term. People just don't tend to do that. They tend to go for a very simplistic approach, which distorts the market around the favourite. And in this modern world, you see a lot of bookmakers saying, well, we had a bad run of results there because the favourite won much more than it should have done. And therefore, that was a bad meeting for us. And everybody goes, oh, don't talk rubbish, because you can balance your book out and you can hedge positions and stuff like that. But a lot of bookmakers don't hedge. And therefore, because there is more money bet on the favourite than you would typically expect, it does adversely affect their ability to run a profitable book if there is a string of winning favourites. So yeah, that is actually something that does happen. And when I've spoken to individual bookmakers or corporations, or I've seen data, and when I look at the actual betting exchange market, where of course you can see all of the data, that is something that continues to hold true. people bet on the favourite more than they should do. So one of the curious things that I discovered, almost by accident really, was how people are staking within the market. And the reason that I say I discovered it almost by accident was because if I put an order within the market and waited for it to get filled, I noticed something really interesting. And that was, say we put, £200, 500 or whatever, waiting to get matched at a certain point within the market. As the price came up and touched that, then people would start to chip away at that. And if you actually look at the Betfair screen, and you look at the matched bets area, you'll actually see a bet reference ID of where you were matched, but you'll also see the amount that was matched against you in that particular market. And if you have a larger stake than average within the market, you see people chipping away at that. And that tells you exactly what people were betting on the other side. And you begin to realize that people are very set in their ways in terms of the way that they're likely to bet in any of these particular markets. And the best way to illustrate that is to bring up a spreadsheet, because what I did was I got all of the bet reference IDs, all of the amounts that I was getting matched on, shoved them into a spreadsheet just to see if I could see any particular biases within the market. So if I bring up that graph, I can describe to you what you're actually looking at. Now, as we know, the shorter the price is, then you tend to get more people betting on it. But the interesting thing is the actual individual stakes on it tend to vary. And you tend to find that they're clustered, for example, around the minimum bet size on Betfair, but you'll also see little peaks around things like £5, £10, 25, 50, 100 and so on, where people are using fixed stakes to individually bet within the market. So yeah, it was quite interesting to see and understand that when people were approaching the market, they were just sort of betting in this particular manner, because you would have seen in other videos where I'm suggesting that you either Dutch something or you lay to a fixed liability, or you cover certain aspects or proportions of the market, and therefore you wouldn't use a fixed stake in this particular manner. So that tells you that a lot of people within the market aren't using any particular staking logic. They're just going with their gut, sticking a 5 or a 10 on something, and that is it. So yeah, I discovered this sort of almost by accident by looking at how people were matching my orders within the market. So you may have seen me in some videos where I'm analysing a trade or something saying, well, I'm going to put my closing orders here, or I'm going to put an order here, or this will be significant within the market. And the reason that I did that is because having traded a lot of markets, I began to figure out that there were certain points within the market where the market either slowed down or, it took a lot of effort to go through a particular price point. Or say the market had come from here to there and was heading back out in the other direction, I'd begin to realise that there was a limit to how far that would likely go. So I started analysing that as well. I started looking at all of those key points in the market, where the odds moved, did they spend more time at certain levels within the market and other stuff like that. And that just gave me a better steer on where I would likely get matched within the market. Because if you put it 2 or 3 ticks outside of that, you're sort of thinking, well, that's just not going to get matched. So that began to shape and form my opinion as to where I should put orders within the market, whether they be opening or closing orders. And the interesting thing is you find all sorts of interesting biases here that spread out across many other different fields as well. So for example, people love round numbers. So as the price begins to approach 2, that will be a key point within the market. But of course, it depends upon the individual circumstances within that market as to how significant it is. Because if the price has come from 6 and it's come all the way down to 2, then that is going to be likely a point of resistance. However, according to many other factors as well, if it breaks straight through that, then obviously that will be deemed as significant. But also when you get a large drift in the market and it goes out to, say, odds of 4, then you'll probably find that it begins to slow down as it particularly reaches that point. Now, I have done videos specifically on crossover points because they are an important aspect and part of trading. But this is a good example, a crossover point, of where the psychology sort of dominates more of what is going on within the market than you would particularly think that they would. And that is because when we get to those key points within the market, they do present an opportunity for you because of the change in the odds increment around sort of 2, 3, 4 and 6. But fundamentally speaking, when they reach that particular point within the market, there's a huge psychological bias about people, whether they will back or lay at those particular points within the market. And you're sort of thinking, well, is that true? Well, yes, it is, because I've done all of the research on it. But also there's other evidence that these are key points whenever you look at any sort of round number. So I stumbled across a study, I can't remember where it was from, hopefully there'll be credit on the image itself, where they were looking at the times that marathon runners ran. And for example, a lot of amateur marathon runners would love to get under 4 hours. And when you actually look at the distribution of marathon finishing times, there was a huge spike just before 4 hours, because if you ran 4:01, that would feel like a disappointment. But if you run 3:59, that's a huge achievement. So everybody gets really focused on running under 4 hours. It's one of those strange psychological things that doesn't really make any sense, but nonetheless, it does exist. And you find exactly the same thing within the betting markets. So what I'm trying to do for you here is I'm not trying to say to you, do this and make a fortune. Although sometimes I'm tempted because I'd probably get more views. What I'm saying to you here are these are interesting things within the markets that occur, that you can look for, that you can understand and see how that influences your strategy. Because every time you turn up to a market or you try and do something, you will have slightly different objectives in terms of what you're trying to achieve and what the market has done before, or even what happened in the market before that. But if you know that these biases exist, that should give you a little bit of momentum, a little bit more surety in terms of what you are trying to do. Because when I first started in my career, I was purely sort of maths based, and over time, I gradually started to introduce more psychological factors and trying to understand human behavior and market behavior. And that is now the dominant characteristic of a lot of what I do. I'm trying to look for those little opportunities in the market where people are likely to make mistakes or the market doesn't seem to match up with reality. And the big difference for me over the years is that where I had a hunch in the early part of my career that these sort of things existed, I now know absolutely that they exist and I have quantified them. So yeah, hopefully these will give you a little hint as to where you can find value in the market, or when you're using a trading strategy, why those key and critical points occur, give you a little bit more confidence to take advantage of them.